Hi, the Celebrated Dragon here with my second video tutorial, and today I'll be talking about the Sicilian opening, focusing mainly on the Open Sicilian, which I think most people agree is the way to, if you want to defeat the Sicilian, you should play the Open Sicilian. You know, people are often afraid of the complexity of the Sicilian lines and the idea that black will be booked up on all the variations and everything, and so they'll play a closed line to kind of avoid that. But really, the best way to counter the Sicilian is to play the open and go for a strong kingside attack. And so we'll go over. Obviously, there's too much theory to really cover it extensively in the format that I want to do, which is about a half hour. So I'm just going to cover. I hope to cover four of what I think are a good cross section of the lines: the Najdorf, the dragon, the Sveshnikov, and the what would it be? Oh yeah, the Kan Sicilian. So I'll just start with the basic moves: e4, c5, and then knight to f3, intending to play the open Sicilian. Knight to c3 or g3, or any of those, or d3 with the signal playing the closed Sicilian. But the idea is to play d4 immediately, and that will, usually c takes d, knight takes d, and we have an open Sicilian. And usually white will castle queenside, push the kingside pawns, and try to get a mating attack going. While black's idea is to do the exact opposite. Black will have queenside chances for a mating attack, especially since black has castled queenside. So here is where black has basically three choices that are, almost always played. There are some sidelines, but the three main choices are either d6, which is kind of the modern line, knight to c6, which is kind of the old Sicilian, but is still very popular because it can lead into lines like the Sveshnikov, and then e6, which I think is called like the French Sicilian or the Paulson variation, which can lead to the Paulson variation. And so, G6 is another sideline, but that's the hyper accelerated dragon, and that, if white wants to, can pretty much always just transpose it to one of the other variations. So we'll only consider really b6, knight to c6, and e6. Start with what's probably the most popular move, which is b6. Just defends or it opens up the line for the bishop and defends the c pawn, and it's just a basic, standard opening move. White, as intended to go to the open Sicilian, now plays d4, and the main line is just pawn takes and knight takes, as I said. Now here, almost invariably, black will play knight to f6, challenging the e-pawn, developing, and also, by playing this right away, black prevents white from playing I don't know what the pronunciation is, I just say the Maroczy bind or something like that, which is c4. That's, in many positions, white will want to play c4, creating this bind on the d5 square, because the d5 square really it's just a vital square in almost all the Sicilian lines. So if white is allowed to have that pawn set up at c4 and e4 with just total control of the d5 square, that really can bind and cramp black's position. So in a lot of lines, black's early focus is to prevent c4 by playing knight to f6, immediately challenging that e4 pawn, which makes white's best response just knight to c3. And notice that now white cannot play c4 anymore. Again, I'm not an expert in the Sicilian, and all I know is that knight c3 is almost always played because it's a good developing move. It defends the pawn. It also solidifies control of d5. Other moves that would allow the Maroczy bind, like bishop to d3 or queen to e2, I think they're anti-positional. They're just not as strong. They don't lead to as good positions, even though they do allow the Maroczy bind. So knight to c3 is by far the mainline move. And now, at this point, this is the first major branch of the Sicilian for the d6 line, for the modern Sicilian. This is where black has basically four major choices, which lead to four pretty unique variations. And I will be discussing two of them, which I think are two of the most interesting and, lead to unique ideas. And those two are the Najdorf, which has just a long and very beautiful theory and history behind it. And then the other I'm going to look at is the dragon, which again is what my chess handle is named after, even though I never really have played the dragon. I just think it's an interesting name, and I like the wordplay with it. Those are the two lines I'm going to focus on. We'll start with the Najdorf. A6 has a number of purposes. The main one being, it blocks b5 from both the knights, and it prevents bishop to c4, or it will eventually if black doesn't play it right away. We can prevent bishop to c4 by them playing b5, at some future point. And so it just begins to get space in the queen side, prepares b5, and prevents the knights from going to b5, where they can be troublesome in a lot of lines, especially if the queen wants to go to c7. Then it's good to have that b5 square blocked off for the knights. Now, white has a number of choices here. I think that the two main lines are either to go into I think it's called the Richter-Rauser attack, which is bishop to g5, and then e6 is usually played. And I won't go into that one. That is definitely a major line. That leads to a lot of interesting games. The one I'm going to focus on is, I think, the currently more popular and interesting one, which is the English attack, which is bishop to e3. And this creates the very well-known, well-studied opening setup for white, where you have these knights at c3 and d4, the bishop at e3, the queen will go to d2, the king will castle long, and we're going to see what happens after that. So this is, in a lot of open Sicilian positions, this is the basic setup for white's plan of attack. And now at this point, black wants to do something in the center, wants to develop, wants to get things going. So the move that I'm going to look at is e5. e6 can also be played, and that just kind of transposes to a Sveshnikov variation, which I will not be looking at, but you can definitely study that on your own. e5 I think is more interesting. I think it's also played more at the club level, at least, because it takes control of the center, it pushes the knight away, and it leads to what I think is one of the more interesting counterattacks by black on the queen side. So after e5, knight to b3 is played, not knight to f3, because white usually wants to play f3 at some point, defending the e-pawn, and then also preparing g4, which is really one of the thematic ideas of the Sicilian. I'll get to that in a second, just after these couple more developing moves. Is bishop to e6, talk about that in a second. And then I think usually, giving me options here, but like I said, the main idea is queen to d2, and then castling queenside, and then maybe black will play bishop to e7 just to allow castling, and then at this point white will castle, and maybe black will castle too. And this is just a really common setup, and now we can talk about some of the thematic ideas as far as I understand them as a 1800 level club player of what's going on in the English attack of the Sicilian. This is a position that I've reached many times, and I've won some games and I've lost some games. You'll almost never get a draw here. So what's going on here is, let's see, who has the move? White has the move. White will probably just play f3, again, defending the e-pawn, and preparing g4, and then maybe eventually g5, and h4, maybe h5, and this is just the typical Sicilian kingside pawn rush to storm the black king and get a mating attack going. And the other point of g4 and g5, I believe, is it's this thematic idea of the vital, supreme importance of the d5 square. By playing g4, g5, you kick the knight away, and then white's knight now can slip in to d5, when black inevitably will also play b5 and b4. So it's this really fascinating opposite attack idea, where both sides are trying to kick away the knight and control d5 that way, and oftentimes it happens at basically the exact same time. But black will often play knight to d7. Knight to c6 is not as good, I believe, because in situations where white puts maybe a knight on d5 and then an exchange happens, if white can then recapture with the pawn, and then the pawn at d5 will fork the knight at c6 and the bishop at e6. So black definitely wants to avoid any chance of that happening. And also with the knight at d7, the knight can swing to d6, and then I think c4 or a4, and it's pretty happy at one of those squares, especially because b5 is coming. So knight to d7 is definitely a mainline move. And then also, of course, it prepares the rook to slide over to c8, which is very common. So now at this point, white will begin his queenside pawn or kingside pawn rush, beginning with g4. And then, again, black has choices here, but, my favorite one is just respond immediately with b5. And then we get this race. This black is going to be doing the exact same thing on the queen side as white is trying to do on the king side, which is rush up with the pawns, dislodge the knight, break up the pawn center, and attack the exposed king. And at this point, the branches and the theory, as far as I can tell, just becomes very, very complex. Lots of choices here for how black and white respond. But I think one that I just want to focus on is like g5, knight to h5, or maybe even responding to g5 with b4. But there's just a lot of other choices here. Also, somewhere in here, if, for example, black moves either the king or the rook to the c file where the king is, in a lot of these lines, like if the queen decides to go there, it's usually a good idea for white to play kind of a prophylactic move and play king to b1 so that his king is out of the firing line of that potential queen and rook battery. And yeah, at this point, I've already used up a lot of time talking about this English attack, but here are the basic ideas are, black will be doing a queen side, at mating attack, and white will be doing the same thing on the king side, and both sides are really trying to, force those, maybe the rook to c8, pawn to, g5, and then that goes over here, and, again, at this point, there's just tons and tons of options for how to play this line. But this is just the basic idea, at least, of the Najdorf, the English attack, which is how I would, often will respond if black goes into the Najdorf. Alright, so let's now change gears and talk about the other main line after at this position right here. Again, this is where black really has 4 choices for how to proceed, and I'm going to focus on 2 of them. The other one is just the dragon. And yeah, not too much that I just want to, briefly go over some of the ideas here, because really, white just has kind of a similar idea. Just the only difference is that black's going to play a little bit differently. Again, black's going to fianchetto kind of that bishop, and now that's a pretty good bishop on that long diagonal, especially notice there's no pawns there, it's going to be an open center, so the bishop will have very good chances for attacking and defense on that diagonal. And then you can see that, usually white will want to just go into pretty much the exact same position with very similar ideas. Castling long, and then going for the, controlling d5 again. Black will probably at some point play d5 to free up the knight and allow the bishop to go along that long diagonal. But let's see, after f3, castles, queen to d2, and I can't remember exactly what the main line moves are here. I think maybe at some point knight to c6 is played, and then this. And then again, so you have the, similar kind of setup for white, at least. White has very similar goals as in the Najdorf. The only difference being that, now that this bishop here is on the diagonal, it's the dragon variation. And so that's going to, white will have to be aware, at least, of the bishop potential there. But, white will have pretty similar ideas, which will be, pushing the g-pawn up. That's called the Yugoslav variation, I believe. And it's just, it's similar. White goes for a queenside mating attack while keeping a watchful eye on the queen side. And again, if necessary, playing that king to b1, that prophylactic move, because, oftentimes that keeps the queen side more safe, more protected than having that king on the relatively exposed position at c1. So yeah, that's the dragon. That's pretty much all I have to say about it. Again, I don't want to try to venture too much into lines that I'm not super familiar with, so just leave it at that. Now let's go all the way back to that second possibility, or 3 possibilities, as I said. Besides d6, black could also play this. This is called the Old Sicilian, and again, white's going to have similar ideas. Going to play this exchange to open the board up, and yet again, black will usually want to play knight to c6 or f6, and then knight to c3 to defend it. And then the one line that I really want to talk about here that I think is a lot of fun and very interesting and unique, this can transpose, just like a lot of these lines can, into other lines, but the one that has a unique flavor is the Sveshnikov E5 is played. And this is, it's a very popular line at the club level. It is somewhat anti-positional in that it creates this hole on D5 and D6, which White will definitely be spending the rest of the game trying to place his pieces on. He begins right away with knight D to B5, threatening immediately to play knight to D6 check, and then all black can really do is capture with the bishop, and then when the queen recaptures, black's position is pretty bad. I got that queen hanging out in the sixth rank, and the king and the black can't really do anything about it. So black's pretty much only move is to play D6, and then now the queen is also defending the D6 square. And so at this point, I believe usually bishop to G5 is played, and then A6 to kick that naughty knight away to A3, where it's kind of out of position here. A knight on the rim is dim, but white doesn't care because, again, white is going to want to basically root all his knights and all his pieces to the D5 square and get total control of it. So now at this point, we enter what the famous Sveshnikov is the thematic move, which is B5. And I believe that was, first innovated by Sveshnikov. And, the idea here, of course, like with most things in the Sicilian, is to gain space on the queen side and allow B7, but also this deadly threat that white has to answer of, B4, forking the two knights. So at this point, there are two major branches. The first just being bishop takes, and then I believe queen takes is pretty bad because it takes the queen away from the defense of the queen side. And after knight to D5, I believe that I can just do a little evaluation here of the engine. Yeah, the queen pretty much has to retreat, so that's just kind of wasting a tempo. And also, G takes is actually pretty good because then it allows F5, which can really kind of undermine white's center and do good things there. And then black will often put the rook on G8, breathing fire down the king side. So if bishop takes is played, G takes is a lot better, even though it doubles the pawns, and we're always afraid of double pawns. In this case, it's a pretty good thing. So that's what happens if the bishop takes, but I think the more interesting of the two moves is actually just playing knight to D5. And then we got this, interesting attack going on the queen side, and also, the knight is on that hole, and the knights, white's plan is to pretty much always have a knight, blockading and occupying this key square right here. And black will do what he can to at least, prevent that or to create some counterplay. So now usually bishop E7 is played, and then I think knight captures. Now that's where I'm going to get to slow down and remember what's going on here. Now I think it's, bishop captures. We want to keep the knight on that really good square on D5. And then usually bishop captures here just to keep that diagonal open for the bishop and queen. Now that the bishop is out, the bishop wants to be there. And then at this point, we have the move C3. C4 is also played, but I think C3 is more popular. I think, it's nicer. It keeps the queen side a little bit more secure for white. And the ultimate point of both of those moves is not to gain space, but to reroute the knight to C2, and then over to E3, where it can then, reinforce the knight and slip into the D5 square if the knight is ever captured. And so that's the point of that move. And then I believe at this point there are a number of options. I just saw this Immortal game with Kasparov versus Topalov, I think. Kasparov versus Topalov, where I think he may play bishop to B7, and then white plays knight to C2. And again, my memory isn't perfect. Maybe black castles here, and then I think the move played I believe was knight to B8, threatening to really just take away that square from the knight, that well-established knight outpost on D5. And here I think Kasparov's incredible, beautiful idea was A4, pawn takes, rook takes, and I forget what the move here was. Maybe it was just castling or something, but then the incredible idea that made the Immortal game, or an Immortal game, was rook to B4, undermining the underminer. This bishop plans to undermine the control of D5 by taking away from the knight, And then the next move, I forget what white played. Oh yeah, I remember. Topolov's idea with knight to b8 was to reroute the knight to c5, where it defends the bishop, and is a well-placed knight, and but Kasparov did not care. He took the bishop, the knight took, and then you can watch the rest of your game yourself. But he just did incredible ideas with that d5 outpost and attacking the king, and just really strangling Topolov. It was a great game. So yeah, that's kind of the ideas of the Sveshnikov. Is again, like with many variations of the Sicilian, white aims to just control the d5 square and use that to cramp black, and black's position is often to counterplay with counterattacks on the queen side. And again, I'm focusing in this with white's ideas because I actually stopped playing the Sicilian as black a while ago. I just don't feel like I'm as good at it on the black side, and I'm just focusing. I play e4 as white, so I've studied a fair amount on how to beat the Sicilian. So I really am kind of biased right now with talking about the white pieces. All right, so you got just one more line that I want to talk about, and for a little bit, and that is, what if black decides to play this French or Paulson? And again, same idea. White always just wants to go into this open line where it can immediately use its spatial advantage and try to get a lead in development and have more space right away to immediately put a cramp on black and get that attack going. Now at this point, what I'm going to focus on is I think it's called the Kan variation with a6, and again you can see similar ideas as with a Najdorf. Black really wants to play b5 with space on the queen side, move the rook to c8, get the knights going, get the queen on c7 maybe, and really punish white on the queen side if white decides to castle queen side. But in this variation, the Kan variation, I actually prefer to have white castle king side, and I'll show you how that goes. So now the line that I would play is, bishop to d3, knight to c3 is also playable, but then after b5, that knight is going to be, ejected, and so there will no longer be a defender of the e4 pawn. So I think bishop to d3 it's a good move for just saying, whatever, you don't not let my knight defend the pawn, so I'll have my bishop do it. And then I think oftentimes at this point, and we know black has a number of options, but we'll just say queen c7, and then castles, and then, again, my memory is not so great here, maybe knight to f6, and queen to e2, and this has a number of nice ideas. I hope I have this line right. I think this is a pretty common standard idea for black, is to have this kind of setup right here. And queen e2 is great because it puts pressure on the e file, so it supports a later e5 push. If white decides to do something like play knight to c6, or black plays knight to c6, white can play knight takes, and then if we have something like b takes, then now e5 is playable as the queen defends the pawn, and now the knight gets pushed around. And queen to e2 also prepares and supports c4 on the queen side, so now that diagonal is very well reinforced. So c4 is going to be played next move pretty much regardless of what black does. Let's just say black plays, like, I don't know, bishop to e7. Probably isn't the main line, but I just want to show what white's ideas are here. Because I believe, many people probably want me to explain how to beat the Sicilian, because that's what everyone is all concerned about. Is people love playing e4, but they hate playing the Sicilian. So this is the basic setup that I like if black plays the Kan variation. It's having this structure right here after c4 and maybe black castles. White plays knight to c3, and I think this has a good reputation and lots of winning chances for white. Black is castled king side. He's pretty safe there. Not queen side. Black will not be able to have his normal mating attack ideas. And white has good central control, and I just think he looks pretty good in this game. So that's it. I think I covered the 4 ones I wanted to: the Najdorf, the Dragon, the Sveshnikov, and the Kan or the Paulson line. So hopefully these ideas helped you out. And yeah, please feel free to leave comments and recommendations for my next video. I try to do one a day, but who knows. All right, thanks a lot.